Good evening, everyone. Tanya, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome to this floor time session, supporting emotional regulation through floor time. And we are very glad and appreciate our sponsor for this session, one of our local ARCs, the ARC of Northern Virginia. Our presenter tonight is Ann Bailey Lipsit, and she is the founder of Lipsit Learning Connection. That's a special education consulting service, and the mission is to empower families, caregivers, and independent schools in giving children the development, support, learning opportunities, and skills needed to live a full, literate, and enjoyable life. So Ann Bailey coaches parents and teachers in creating strong plans to foster a child's social, emotional, inclusive, and academic needs. She has an advanced certificate in DIR floor time. She has a master's degree in special education from UVA. She was a graduate of Washington and Lee, and she's currently a fellow in the Infant Parent Mental Health Fellowship at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. She's also the author of Prevent Behavior Problems. And so, Ann, welcome. We're very interested to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. I think I'm most excited. I haven't actually had the opportunity to attend this conference before, so it worked out really well that it was, for me, that it was virtual, although I'd rather be in person, and get to hear so many of the great speakers that have been going on all week. I'll go ahead and share my screen and get started. Okay, thank you. And I'm hoping that you will not meet my children tonight, although this is going on over bedtime, so there's absolutely no guarantees about anything. So we're going to talk about supporting emotional regulation during floor time. And I'd like to start off with introductions, and then I'll get into a little bit of my floor time journey. Then we'll get into asking like the nitty gritty parts of the presentation. Like what do we mean when we talk about social regulation, emotional regulation? What do we mean when we talk about floor time? Because I know it's a term that can actually be thrown around and it sounds kind of like, oh, you're just sitting on the floor playing with your kid. But there's a little bit more, it can be a little more technical and a little bit more meaningful. And then I think to understand that, we'll get into the what floor time calls the functional, emotional, developmental capacities. And in that, we'll look at those different developmental stages that your child goes through. We'll talk more about your the sensory system. We'll talk about polyvagal theory, serve and return, and then that importance of engaging play. And then I'll give you some DIR resources. So I would love, as we get started, if you would put in the chat who you are, what's your background, are you a self-advocate, are you a parent, a speech pathologist, and then I'd also love to know if you were here last night to hear Alfie Kahn. So while you're doing that, I would really appreciate it so I can kind of tailor what I'm saying to the audience. If there's already lots of floor timers out there, then I will shift what I'm talking about a little bit. Or if it's mostly teachers and mostly schools. So as you heard in the introduction, I am a special education consultant and DIR floor time practitioner. I started my career in education in teaching general education first grade, and I absolutely adore first grade. I think it's the best grade, the best developmental year when kids are in elementary school. But I also realized that in teaching first grade, and I always had the inclusion classroom, that my heart was really in working with the children with the IEPs. And I wanted to know more, and I wanted to dig deeper and do better. So then when I got my master's degree, I flopped and I became I became the special ed teacher in the inclusion classroom. And after I did that for years, and I love inclusion, I saw it was a full inclusion program. I saw the benefits of it, but I felt I needed to get more understanding and dig deeper. And so I went and I had the opportunity to work in teach in an intellectual disabilities classroom in Fairfax County. I did that for a while before I was local screening chair for a school in Fairfax, and then I started this piece. So thank you all for putting this in. This is great to hear how many of you heard Alfie Con last night. So you have a little bit, it's a very nice setup for this. So my experience with Floortime, where I kind of fell into Floortime, was in this local screening role, which is really you're just sitting there and you're helping with all the paperwork in special ed, which is really, I always feel like I started in the least restrictive environment teaching general education, and then all of a sudden I ended up in an office just doing paperwork, and it was the absolute most restrictive environment for the teacher. But you're sitting there and you're looking at all the paperwork for eligibility. And we had a case that came up, and the parent was saying the child had a medical diagnosis of autism, and the parent was, my child has autism. He qualifies. This is, I need services. And the team was having this fight in front of me, and I didn't know the child. I was just there to run the meeting, and the mom had left. And the team was saying, we still see some of this quirky behavior, but we don't see autism. And then the school psychologist, I just remember her putting her pencil down and going, y'all, I know he's got autism, but he had DIR Floortime, so we don't see it. He doesn't look like you would typically, what you're used to. And we were like, excuse me, like, bless you? What? Like, are you okay? None of us had heard about it. And I was like, how have I been in education 15 years and not heard about something that would create this intervention or this support that you're telling me that's the reason that we as professionals can't agree on this child's educational eligibility. And so I fell down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out what this is. And I did training in different places. And the more I learned, the more I realized how much I didn't know. So preface this in two places to say that not every child who goes through Floortime, I'm not saying that, it makes it so your child doesn't present as if they have autism. That was clearly that unique case, but that's really what got me interested, to be like, wait a minute, I usually can tell a child can function, but you can still tell, like, you can tell they're following a script. This child didn't look like he was following scripts. And so if you heard Alfie Kahn last night, I felt like he was speaking so much to my experience, because I went through that behaviorist background, and I'm good at that. I'm pretty good at getting children to learn how to teach a concrete task and using it. And whenever I feel like Floortime isn't working, I'll have to catch myself, because I immediately go back into that more comfortable, like, oh wait, no, I can do this. I can do a token system and this works. But when I went to Floortime, it was like we were speaking a different language. And it took me a really long time. It was like this earth shattering, like I thought I was teaching kids all this time, but now I don't even know what they're talking about. So if you are having any of those moments of like, wait, what are you talking about? At some point, I think I called Floortime voodoo magic, because I was like, I don't understand why it's working. And what I always did isn't working. Just bear with me, keep reading the books, keep finding videos, because I swear every day I sit with a parent and we see the progress. I'm like, yeah, I know I told you this was going to happen, but I can't believe it. It's like, this is so cool. Okay, so Floortime works on developing those four core capacities of what really makes us a human being. So its focus is not on changing individual behaviors or teaching at all, which is where I had my biggest problem with it, but looking at that social self-regulation, engagement, relating, communicating, and thinking and reasoning. And really, those are the four capacities that we need to live productive lives. We have to be able to regulate ourselves, engage with our world, communicate with those around us, get our needs met, and more importantly, enjoy being around each other, which is why that engagement relating piece comes first. And then we have to think and reason. So it's really about supporting all of that. And it works on those in that progression of that, because this is how development happens. We go from being from an infant where our bodies are just working on self-regulation and being able to get food and suck, swallow, breathe, and can we breathe while we're getting food? When we go all the way into that, that 4-year-old who can problem solve, or the 10-year-old who can problem solve. And so really what I find floor time works on the most, again, not those individual skills, but it's that sense of agency, that idea that I have wants and needs, and I am a person. And if I'm hungry and thirsty, I know how to make that happen. And my opinions are important. And you can see there is my daughter. She has a lot of agency. She might have too much. She's the unicorn who's like, I don't really like this pasta. Which, of course, you can have agency, but still be told have boundaries, and that's what you're eating for dinner. And then ideation. And ideation is that idea that we're putting meaning behind kids' actions, that meaning behind what they do, that they can have a thought and follow it through. And when they grab for something, we can, that, oh, you want that. And like starts, you're thirsty, you're hungry. We're creating this awareness and bringing meaning to these just automatic reactions. So a great place to learn about floor time is the International Council for Development and Learning, or ICDL, as Alfie Kahn mentioned last night. And they write, again, like I said, that DIR sees behaviors as a manifestation or the result of a process of what's going on inside the child's mind and body. So not looking at that behavior as we need to fix it, but looking at it as this is a way to communicate to the world, or just this is a sign for us that something's interfering and we need to figure out what that is. What's happening to make what's interrupting in that, what's keeping you from feeling safe? And then working while doing that, also working on strengthening those core capacities. So, and Dr. Giltippy, who is one of my favorite floor timers to hear speak, and there were some questions last night about adults and adults experiencing this, and he actually has a residential program in California, and it's a working farm. So it's just like they're dirty and they're like, he's just always like, he's talking and he'll like have, the mud, because they were out there and they're growing the food. But it is for adults with autism, and he just started that a few years ago. But I took a course with him this spring, and he described DIR as doing microsurgery on people's brains, because it's a subtle work on neurodevelopment. And it's this careful analysis of, okay, where a child is developmentally, where they can be developmentally with support, and then what's interfering from going further. And then I have this hand model of the brain, because what I find when I talk about brain development, I often get into waving my hand around. So I had to remind myself to share this with you all. This is Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain. And I use this when I'm talking with kids and parents, and I think it's just such a it's a great visual. So if you put your hand up like this and you cover your thumb right there, we've got your the thumb becomes your amygdala, or your limbic system. And that's where your emotions are housed, and those fight-flight responses are housed. And so when you have that emotional reaction, it's happening here in your amygdala. Now, when you put your hand down, right here, you've got your prefrontal cortex, which is part right here in your brain, your forehead. And that's where all of our thinking happens. And in this image, it calls it the human brain. Because yes, animals have this. They can be scared, they can be happy, they have these memories that make them react in a certain way. But we've got this piece here that helps us reason. And unfortunately, it develops, it's so important to us, but it takes time to develop, and it develops last. And we also don't use it as much as we should, because when we process information comes up through the brainstem right here, the lizard brain. And that's what keeps us regulated. But if our brainstem and anything else in our brain sees that there's a threat coming, it's going to shut down what's above it. And that's why when we get worried, we literally, as Dan Siegel says, pop our top, because we're working in that amygdala piece here, and we're not using our reasoning. And it's important. I think about this with myself all the time, that I'm like, oh, I'm reacting this way. I need to connect my amygdala and prefrontal cortex. I find it essential when I'm working with my children, my own more even, because I have a harder time being patient with my own children. I don't know if you guys are like that, but having to remind myself that there's no logic going on right now. It's all coming from here. It's very emotional. So that leads us into what is emotional regulation. And that is really a piece that does require a lot of that work from the prefrontal cortex. We've got to be able to identify our emotion, identify what's triggering us, how we're feeling, why we're feeling that way, then calm ourselves. And then we either have to act based on what we've interpreted, or we have to inhibit our actions. And that takes a lot. That takes all of those brain processes right there. And so this is a piece that we often are working on. We often teach in schools. I spend a lot of time working on teaching this in small groups. And so it's definitely that we can teach it, but to fully support it and to fully help a child be able to use all of those tools, because they've got to be able to have that prefrontal cortex, we've got to teach it. We've really got to support from the bottom up. So we talk about two different ways to present information to a child. We have that top down, which a lot is what Alfie Kahn was talking about last night with, he talked a lot about ABA, and we're teaching those direct skills. We're teaching it through here. They're direct instruction. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with top-down instruction. We all do it all the time. And there's times that's the best way to learn information. But when we're looking at bottom up, we're really looking at getting those lower regions of the brain to recognize the stressors in the environment and to respond appropriately without using that prefrontal cortex, without having to almost use those scripts. So we're looking at two different processes. Instead of saying, hey, when you're feeling frustrated, you need to take a deep breath and calm down, we're doing it with the child. We're practicing it together. We're helping them taking deep breaths so they can see and feel what we're talking about. And then over time, their body's going to practice it and get it. So what does DIR stand for? I get that question all the time. It's developmental, individual, and it's relationship. And we'll get more into the developmental and individual piece. But this relationship piece, I do want to touch on, because I think sometimes it can get lost when we're talking about a child, about how essential it is for that child to have that key relationship with a caregiver and their teacher. Because who we are as people is how we define ourselves as people is how we understand ourselves from the person we're interacting with. And we see that as babies start to understand, oh, like I'm not my mom. And then they start to understand, if my mom's gone, I still exist. I'm here. She's not there. They're starting to get that object permanence. They realize they can reach out and touch her. She's a different object. And I say mom, but I mean, primary caregiver. So excuse me for that. But so that relationship piece, and they begin to develop, oh, like I have different feelings from my mom or from my caregiver. I once had a little boy when I was teaching general education first grade, and before I really understood much of special education. And he used to bring me signs of how he was feeling, because he was so mad that if I was happy and he was sad, and he'd be like, you need to be sad and bring me this piece. And so that's that place of like helping him understand through that relationship that we're bringing that, oh, we're developing your sense of self. You are your own person, and that's that agency, but we only develop that through our relationship with others. And of course it needs to be a positive, well, it doesn't need to be, but to develop a healthy sense of self, it needs to be a healthy relationship with others. And that's where this piece of supporting and working together comes in. So with the individual differences in DIR Floortime, it's really important to go back and look at everything about the child, what their birth history, even some of the prenatal pieces of what's going on here. Because a lot of that can put light into the relationship. If the child was in the NICU for a really long time, that could have altered some of that beginning relationship piece. One of the things I personally have a hard time with whenever we talk about that is like, always that mom guilt of like, what did I do wrong? It's never anything wrong. It's not like, oh, that could have been better. No, it is. And because we now know that your brain continues developing through life, it's just giving us that piece of like, oh, this might not have developed because it was at the normal time. So now we're going to foster it. We're going to foster that development and keep going. The background is important and traumatic events, the amount of, how that child, kind of going back to the relationship of how that child processes themselves and their family, where they go, and then looking at that sensory processing piece. Because and this is something that was always hard for me when I was in the school system, because we didn't talk about sensory processing at all. But that reminder that we process the world through our senses. Like, there's no avoiding our sensory preferences. That's what happened, our preferences and our processing. And we process them bottom up through the brain. So when we are looking at something interfering for a child, we have to take into account, what are they processing in this environment that we might not be, or what's interfering? We look at their receptive, expressive language, and then their motor planning. And motor planning is a key piece here, because you realize that if you have difficulty motor planning and you have difficulty getting what you want, or if you have as a baby, you have difficulty, reaching out, who you are and how you're developing your sense of self and all those other pieces of development also start to become impacted. And so your ability to relate to somebody and to learn how to calm down, you might be missing certain cues because of that motor planning piece. So it's fascinating. And one of the things I love about DIR is that you're looking at the whole child. You're considering, you need to talk to their occupational therapist. You need to talk to the speech pathologist. You're looking at how all of these pieces interplay, because nothing is in isolation. You can't just have speech and can't just have OT or PT, because all of these go together and build on themselves. There's one little boy that I work with, and there's a couple of pictures of him in here. But I was working with him, and one of the things I love about Floortime is that you're encouraged to always have a mentor. So I was in supervision, and she was like, he's got to learn how to do, and she listed a whole bunch of OT things I hadn't heard of. This was early on in my Floortime career. And so then about 2 months later, I go, and he's doing all of those things my mentor had said. And I asked his mom, I was like, what are they doing in OT? And she's like, oh, we just got a new OT. She's amazing. And she's specializes in Floortime. I was like, oh, that's it. That's a why. So she got all of those components there. And then we were able to suddenly see all of this social and academic growth that wasn't going to be possible until he had those OT pieces in place. Which again is a hard thing for me to handle, because we as special ed teachers, we want to be like the superheroes and do it all, but it really has to be this like overarching effort. Okay, so Floortime looks at developmental progression through functional and emotional developmental capacity. And it's important to think about this as not just a ladder that you just go up. It's not like learning to read, where you're at a level, you're at your kindergarten level, and then later on in your life, you're at a 4th grade level, and you're never going to go back to that kindergarten level. It's actually, it's a progression, but you go back up and down the ladder all day. So you start when you're born at that social regulation and interest in the world, self-regulation. And so you can go, you develop that one ladder capacity. And then as you get a little older, you develop the capacity, another rung on the ladder, to engage and relate in your world. And then you go up, but that into two-way communication. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to go back down the ladder when something goes wrong. So it's how many rungs you have in your ladder, and then how many you can use. And when we all, at some point during our day and during our weeks, end up going to the bottom rungs of our ladder. We end up in that self-regulation piece where we have to regulate ourselves before we can go back up. And I think the best example of that is looking at March, and what happened to all of us in March. I know at the beginning of March, I just started my fellowship program. I felt like I was just like, I just felt so, I don't know, lack of a better word of it, like intellectual. I was like writing papers. This is awesome. There was this COVID thing, but I laughed at my Uber driver who sprayed me down before I got into the Uber, because I was like, he's really overreacting to that COVID thing. Less than a week later, the world had stopped. The bottom had fallen out. And whereas before, in the beginning of March, I certainly felt like I was at the top rung of that ladder, 1 week later, I was at the, definitely at the bottom, regulating, trying to stay safe, trying to figure out what this meant for my family. And we all were. And it's hard now because we're still living much like we were in that beginning, in that mid-March, but we forget that emotional reaction we have. And I know that on Facebook, you could see people were posting things like, I'm a writer and I can't write. I'm an artist and I can't draw. And that, I think, is the best example of, it doesn't mean, there's times that doesn't mean you can't do it, but there's times that we are just so stressed that our body isn't using that top of our brain, that prefrontal cortex. It's working on that Maslow hierarchy of needs. We're down here, we're working on the lower rungs, and we've got to take care of that before we can build back up. And that's important to think about when we're talking about the kids, our kids, because we have to remember, we can't, it's hard, it can be frustrating when you're like, you did this, you were calm yesterday, this didn't bother you yesterday. But remembering that we don't always know what's going on with them. So that first stage, interest in the world, you can see the baby gazing in the camera and the baby gazing at the grandmother, and just that being able to regulate. And I'm going to show you. You'll have to indulge me for a minute because my brother actually just had a baby. And I thought they sent me this video, and you know, when you have a new baby, oh, it says my screen sharing is paused. Resume. I wonder if I cannot show this. All right, I will not subject you to my.
Is it a video or what was it? I'm sorry.
It's a video, but don't worry about it. It was just it's just an example of that. That baby that's interested in, it's just interest in the world, that like he was calm, he was regulated, he can hear his mom's voice and turn, so it's not just interest in the objects. So we think about supporting that self-regulation, and while it develops in infants, like I said, we all work on it all day, all the time. And to do that, we have to think about how our nervous system responds to those outside factors. And part of that is the sensory input. Another part is, does the sensory input trigger any implicit memories we might not even be aware of, but it could, the certain smell. I'm guessing that next March, the turn in the air from winter to spring is going to remind us a lot about all of what we experienced this past March. And we're all going to be a little off and a little unsettled, and we're not going to know why. And then stressful events themselves. And I have this picture of a beach here, because I don't know if any of you are familiar with the circle of security training and system, but they talk about how they talk about shark music and how you can be sitting there, you can be at the beach, and you'll have this beautiful moment of, you know, you can have the soundtrack playing of the water's lapping and there's breeze going, you can hear the leaves and you can hear the birds. And so that's some people's experience of the beach. But somebody else, all you have to do is change that soundtrack into that Jaws music, and that shark music is coming at you, and all of a sudden that what was a peaceful beach to someone else is absolutely not a peaceful beach anymore. And we have to keep that in mind when we're working with families and we're working with children, that there's this underlying shark music that we don't necessarily understand. We can't say, well, you know, this really isn't that stressful a room. The sensory input isn't bad. We don't know what a child's shark music is going on there. So we always have to go back to thinking about, well, what can we do? Are they regulated? If not, how do we get them there? I have a good friend whose son, one day it rained on a Thursday, and he got in trouble in PE. And from then on, if it rained on a Thursday, he wouldn't go to school. Like she would make him, but like he would throw a tantrum. And it took a long time to figure out that he was like, if it rains on a Thursday, I'm going to get in trouble in PE. But the rain triggered that shark music in him, and he's always looking behind what's going on in this behavior. Before the COVID example, when I talk about the capacity, when is your capacity one stressed? I think another great example to be able to relate to this is when you're lost in the city, and to take for a moment, you're going to the Kennedy Center, or I don't know Richmond well, but somewhere in Richmond, you've got your kids in the back seat, you're playing the soundtrack to the play you're about to go see, and you're having this great time. You're having this really great conversation with them. And then all of a sudden it starts to rain. And then as it's raining, you realize that where your navigation is telling you to go, they've closed that street and you don't know how to get there. And then you realize you're late and you've gotten turned down on some road that you don't think is safe. What is the first thing you do? And it's turn down the radio. And if you're like me, it's probably say something not very nice to your kids, like be quiet. in a not very friendly voice, and then they cry, and then it's just a big thing. So, but it's not that you can't access those higher capacities. It's not that you can't have a conversation with your kids while you're singing along to the radio and drive. It's that you were too stressed. Your cup got too overflowed. Your cup got too full and it overflowed. And then your brain literally needed to start cutting off energy to other places so it could focus on one piece. And that's when we're talking about capacity 1. And it cracked me up. At some point I Googled like lost when driving, and this meme came up, and I was like, that's genius. That's what I'm talking about. So it's talking about sensory processing. I won't talk on this too much. I'm not an OT, but if you work with any floor timer, the first thing they're going to do as they watch a child is to try to see what the child's how the child's taking it in their sensory information. And we're looking at all 7 senses, not just those original 5, but also that proprioceptive and vestibular. And we're looking to see, is the child overreactive or underreactive? So are they, there's children that you can take them into a loud cafeteria and they'll just start like crying because it's so loud, or they'll become very dysregulated. But then there are other children you can take into a cafeteria and they don't even seem to be fazed by the noise, and somebody yells across the room and they don't even turn and look. So they would be underreactive to that auditory stimulation, whereas the child that doesn't even want to go into the cafeteria might be overreactive. But then even within those categories, we have, is the child seeking or avoidant? So a child could be underreactive to sound, but is seeking it, loves that sound, but can't get enough of it. And we see this a lot in children with vestibular and proprioceptive. And actually one of my children loves that balance and spinning, and she cannot ever get enough spin. We actually ordered her a sit and spin, so she like had this, we never did like a sensory diet, we never called it a sensory diet, but we ordered a sit and spin so that she could, if like she learned, if I get frustrated I need to go and spin before I can come back and talk to my parents, because then I'll be a nicer person. Like she couldn't get enough of it. Whereas my other daughter, that will just make her sick. She can't. So you can be, they want more of it or it's too much. And so you'll see that is, oh, the sound is too much. My other daughter's, walking around wearing, I picked her up today from her little camp, and she was wearing headphones and she said, it's just too loud. Okay, that's fine. So through all of these pieces, I feel like I'm throwing a lot at you, so I'm sorry. Is we're looking at it's really the polyvagal theory is, there's so much to it, and I'm not going to get into it that much, but he does state so nicely that we have 3 states. We have a state of social engagement, and really that's when our brain is fully, everything is intact and right there. We have defense states, physiological state, excuse me. So that fight or flight, we're like in defensive, we're defense, we're ready to react and react emotionally. And then that life threat, where our body is and this is it's adapted over time. This is what our bodies do, and it saves us in so many situations, but it starts shutting down the other aspects of our system so that we can survive. So it limits all the energy here, and it's just using energy from the brainstem. And so when we're looking at children through misbehavior, or we're looking at what's going on, we're really looking at, well, how is the body responding to this stress, and what state are they in? And I know I keep talking about, I've showed you that there's 6 FEDCs, the developmental capacities, and we're still in the first one. But what I have found time and time again is that safety, that feeling of safety and that feeling of security is everything. And I have seen children, a lot of the children, I work with children who, they might not have a diagnosis, but something is keeping them from accessing school. And so their families have decided to homeschool them while they figure this out. And every time we come into, there's something in safety, and they look regulated at first. They look like they should be, like that word should, be able to handle school. And then as you get into it, you start to realize there's these huge safety pieces in the nervous system that they're going to have to work through before they're able to come and be an engaged participant in a group or in a school setting. So again, it's always thinking, going back to that shark music, and not assuming that a child, they should be able to do this, but like they could do it yesterday. What's going on here? It's looking deeper. add that. And so when we're thinking about that social emotional or regulation piece, that we're look beyond just eliminating the behavior, the observable behavior, because we can eliminate the observable behavior, but that doesn't mean we can stop a child's reaction, but that doesn't mean that they're going to then be able to access their prefrontal cortex and be able to reason their way out of it and to move on. We could actually just shut them down, but then they're sitting and they're following directions. But it doesn't mean that they actually have that sense of agency behind what they're doing. So if the first thing to do is provide signals of safety, and then went through that, we're allowing for social engagement to emerge spontaneously. Now, if you are interested in learning more about this, I highly recommend the book Beyond Behaviors by Mona Delahook. And she does a beautiful job of going into a lot of these pieces. I don't think she refers to DIR, but she is a floor timer and she has got a lot of DIR floor time pieces in here. But has excellent, she does just such a beautiful job of explaining, especially the polyvagal theory and that importance of safety. So then we go into the next capacity, which is engaging and relating. And that's when we're looking at when the child starts to respond to the overtures. They'll anticipate an object that's removed, which is so much fun. When they're like, wait, where was that? You can start to play games. They want you to respond, get involved during play. And okay, I'm gonna try to shift. I don't know if anybody has already seen this video. I saw it and was so excited because I was like, that's it. That's what we want. Look at this. Like that baby is so engaged with her father. Her whole body is into it. She stops when he stops. And then when he stops, she's like, come on, go. Okay. All right. I could watch that so many times because that's just the most beautiful engagement right there. That baby is so 100% with her dad. Sorry, what's going on with my screen? Goodbye. Okay, so that takes us into the next one, which is the third developmental capacity, loading, which is that two-way purposeful communication. And now this is referred to in lots of different ways in different places that you might look at. DIR calls two-way purposeful communication circles, and the back and forth interactions that you're having, reciprocal communication. The Harvard Center for Developing Child calls it serve and return. And I think that's the most beautiful explanation for it. Like, the phrase just says it all, because it's that idea that you're serving the ball across the net to the child and they're sending it back to you. And you have that back and forth interaction going. And then, but maybe the child picks up another ball and then they initiate the serve and they send it back. But you're looking for how many times you can keep that one ball going back and forth. In DIR, through this one, in two-way purposeful communication, we're getting into that piece of that back and forth. And that is my nephew and my daughter, and they were just like, he has not yet learned to talk, but he and my daughter were getting into this adorable, like, giggling and kind of, making noises back and forth at each other. And so it's important to remember that this piece, this two-way communication, can be nonverbal. In fact, usually when we're talking about safety, creating that sense of safety, and when we're talking about children who might have they might have receptive language difficulties. And so they're not hearing your voice, or they're not processing your voice, or it's kind of shutting them down. They hear voice and they turn away because it's too much. So you can do two-way communication without having that verbal connection with it. So there's all kinds of different, peekaboo is a great one to, peekaboo is a lot of engaging, but you kind of waiting, like, oh, am I gonna, when are you gonna see me? And then when they say something, and getting into that, just a back and forth, that they're initiating it, you're initiating it, and you want them to be initiating it too. So it's very fun. I have another quick video on the beginning of serve and return. What time do we have? Actually, I think I'm not going to show that, but I recommend Harvard Center for Developing Child has amazing, they have so many resources on serve and return. There's a great video. There's one that's 2 minutes on building neurons and that capacity, which is fantastic. And then there's much longer ones on how to build serve and return. And if there's any, that is that key piece, because that's when the child is building their identity, they're building their agency, and they're understanding the intent, and they're developing their ideation through these interactions with you. One thing that Dr. Stanley Greenspan, who is the founder of DIR, wrote was the Affect Diathesis Hypothesis, which has big words, and I don't, but the piece of this is that the infant's ability to connect affect with our big happy voices and theirs and our expressions, or intent, to motor planning, and that there is this huge piece here with motor planning, and that motor planning difficulties in motor planning can really interfere with developing this two-way communication. So if we are looking, well, what is keeping this child from having these circles of communication? What's keeping them? Is it a motor planning piece? And speech is motor planning too. And we've seen that. I was so excited to watch The Reason I Jump. It was so beautiful, but that was talked about a lot there, that speech is motor planning. And you can see children who it's there, they have the thought, and getting it out is difficult. And so making sure that we are having times to do two-way communication that is through gestures. Another study that came out in 2018, I was so excited to see this, because we'd always known about that 10,000 word gap, and that children from from middle class families were more likely to hear more words throughout their lives than children from lower socioeconomic families. But another study that was done they were measuring the utterances between families in the home, found that these circles, the serve and return interactions, reciprocal communication, actually showed greater changes in bronchios area, so the language area of the brain, despite independent of their socioeconomic status, IQ, or adult child utterances alone. So it didn't have the changes they saw in the child's language development. Didn't have anything to do with the family's socioeconomic background, IQ, or how much the adult talked to the child. It was all about the back and forth interactions. And so that is such a critical piece here, that when we are working on developing these children. And it can be tough for a child who isn't communicating verbally, or for a child who will just play by themselves unless you interact. And it can be really subtle. And that's where you're coming in and you're just gently opening these circles, and you're watching for your child's. So much of this is watching for your child's intent, and then honoring their intent. And you'll see it start to develop, that they're like, oh, wait, like she's noticing what I want. Like that's exactly it. And you can start to build it from there. So cool. So how, using this stage, supporting this two-way communication, how do we use that to support emotional regulation? The most important thing is to listen. Give them an opportunity to speak, to explain. If they aren't using language verbally, mirror their emotions and label it. Match their sad face. I've had a lot of kids that are dysregulated, and you just go and join them in that. And sometimes even being a mirror for their body and their to just kind of say, hey, I'm here for you and I see you. Providing those safety cues, asking questions instead of distracting them from their emotion, kind of following into that, talking about it. And then for a lot of times, language can interfere with a child's ability to process what you're saying. Like their understanding of their I'm sorry, it's late, I'm not being coherent. Their ability to their receptive language abilities might make it difficult for them to, hear what you're saying as you're trying to comfort them. So dropping your language, upping your affect, upping your gestures, and just being there and being calm. All right, so the next FEDC is when you're getting into, you've got more circles of communication, and the child is starting to be able to problem solve. They're starting to be able to reason, and they can do it together. They can do it with somebody. So I've seen children who are fantastic at, they want to get the cookies that you've hidden above the refrigerator. And so they can get it, but that ability to work with you to get it throws them off. They really just want you out of the way. Whereas what we're looking for here, and with those children that's trying to develop, that we do this together, this back and forth, and we're that gesturing piece. Again, all of this can be nonverbal. They're gesturing, they've taken your hand, they led you to the cookies, they've pointed. They're like, I don't know, you don't get those cookies, and they get the chair and trying to help you, get you to hold the chair so they can climb up on it. All of those pieces are building this. And so that working together and the movement, you're seeing more movement. Another piece here is using imitation to deal with recovery from distress. So a lot of times what we'll see is that parents will say, oh, they've skipped their terrible twos. It's been amazing. They've always been sweet, because they're developing along a later trajectory, but they're still developing. We follow these progressions. We just don't always do it on the same time. So then all of a sudden you start to see the child who has been an angel all their life start saying no when they're told no. And it's like, wait, what happened to my baby? But unfortunately, we all have to go through this stage of understanding who we are, and that's our agency and our ideation. And so we are going to start to see that they're starting to yell and protest and anger, and it's a really good thing, even though I'm hiding my gray hair right here from my children going through it. So in this stage, what can we do when we're working on emotional regulation? We really want to solve the problems together. And they want those cookies, and you're not going to give them the cookies. I think there's a piece to this that we can maintain boundaries, but we also are working to solve the problems together. We don't want to do it for them, and we don't just want to make those problems go away. We're listening to their concerns. You're still mirroring their emotions. You're honoring that, you want that cookie. I know. I want the cookie too. But dinner time, it's in 10 minutes. First we'll have dinner, then cookie. And then helping them solve the problem, not going up to get the cookie themselves for them, or by distracting them, letting them kind of work through that frustration, letting them feel that frustration and then that success. So Alfie Kahn last night mentioned Russ Green, another book that I love all of his books. He has a podcast. I recommend that. I think it's old. I don't think there's anything new on it, but I can listen to it over and over again and get input. So this was one on parenting, raising human beings, but it's just this idea that you go and you talk to your child and you problem solve it together. So the next FEDC is using symbols and creating emotional ideas. And this is when we start to see play emerge, symbolic play. And the thing we have to remember when we're talking about academics too, we bring in that academic piece, is that all of academics are numbers, are letters, understanding that the number 1 represents 1 dot, it represents the word 1, that's symbolic. And so until we've got real symbolic and a real understanding of symbolic thinking, the child might learn the letters and numbers, but they're not going to fully be ready to apply it until they understand the symbolic thinking behind it. But they're starting to use, and they're pretend play, and they're using that play to recover from distress. And here's a picture of my daughter. It's hard to see. My husband, this was a few years ago, and he had just been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and he's okay now. It was Hodgkin's lymphoma, so we're all good. But my daughter at the time was 3, and so you can't see this, but in one hand she has a Playmobil doctor, and then she's got the nativity scene because it was Christmas. And let me tell you that every single person in that nativity scene had to go to the hospital for 2 weeks and had to get checked by the doctor. And they went through all of the procedures that she knew about that my husband had gone through using words she picked up on. And it can be really tempting to be like, oh, no, it's gonna be okay, and avoid it. But this is how she was processing it. So when we are looking at supporting emotional regulation here, we're allowing for these play themes to happen. We're providing open-ended toys. We're kind of setting in with the uncomfortableness of it. And following that play, like, oh, that doctor's keeping everybody safe, kind of giving them some language to pair with that. This picture is of once I had started doing telesessions. I had a child, all of our sessions had always included this little rat and skunk puppet. Well, he decided they needed to have masks. And so like, I'm looking around my desk, I'm like, and we're on Zoom, so they can't get the, get COVID through it, but no, they needed masks. And so I tried to fashion masks out of, those are Post-it notes. It works. But understanding that was his way. He also he was very dysregulated when he saw people in masks. So he needed to see the animals in masks and he needed to explore those feelings. So it's really honoring that play. And then the last FEDC we're going to talk about today, there are 12 of them, and they're on the ICDL website if you want to know more. But the ones that we primarily focus on are the first 6, is building those logical ideas and building those bridges between ideas and the logical thinking piece. And this is a place I feel we often see gets constricted in elementary school, because we've got the kid with lots of language, we've got a kid with lots of symbolic thinking, and they're memorizing things very quickly. But that ability to apply 2 different ideas and put them together can be difficult. And then we also take into that all of the different processing pieces, because you can see children do it in one realm and they can do it very quickly when it's auditory ideas, but when you have visual pictures, and they're asked to make a mental image in their head, then they start having constrictions here, because they're very verbal, but don't have that visual picture in their head to start to be able to manipulate it. And so there's, looking at that, okay, we're not here yet, what do we need to do? And if you notice that on the bottom of that, it said begins to answer who, what, where, why questions. Those questions are tricky and they come late. They're really this stage. And so it's keeping in mind too, that a lot of times we'll write IEP goals to say, well, answer who and what questions. And we can train a child to answer those questions. I've done it many times and I've had success, but that doesn't mean that child understands what they're answering. I've trained them to say, if I say who is in the story, they can answer that question, but it doesn't mean they really understand what they're answering. Not until they really get to FED6, and then it's going to come fluently. And so when they're in this stage, FED6, so how do we support their emotional regulation? We problem solve together. Going to that Ross Green, he does this great, he calls it drilling. And he says, hey, I've noticed, whenever we say it's time for dinner, you yell and slam the door to the bathroom. What's up? And so it's saying it without judgment, without, I'm tired of this every time. This is a pattern. It's just showing the child, oh, I notice all this stuff. What's going on? And talk through, I like when in this stage, you get children who love to make up their own games, and the rules in the games can change. And this is where you can really see restrictions of this capacity if they're making up their own game, because they can have a game, but it doesn't quite make sense yet. But to them it does, but they haven't quite put the logical bridges together between the 2 ideas. But they also will make it so that they can't ever lose. And so starting to be like, well, wow, I noticed you've won every time. What would it feel like if I won? And so you're not saying you won, you're gonna, but starting to explore that feeling with them. That seems really important to you, you won. What would that feel like? And then that's a really big feeling. And then sometimes kids use words to describe what's going on, and their words that they're using aren't appropriate. And back to that reserving that judgment of, wow, you must be really mad. That's a big feeling word. And just kind of sitting with it there and talking about it. So we've gone through all of those, but I think what's important to remember here is that when we have a child who is dysregulated, when we have a spouse who's dysregulated, we need to go down to go up. And so, and Dr. Bruce Perry of the neurosequential model talks about how we need to regulate, relate, and then reason. And that fits right back into that, corresponds perfectly with the FEDCs in our hand model of the brain. We have to be safe. We have to regulate first. Whatever is going on, we're not going to fix it until that child feels safe and has those sensory cues. Then we have to relate. We have to get that emotion in place. We have to build that relationship. And not until those are done are we ready to start reasoning and processing those pieces. So here I have some resources if you're interested in learning more on DIR Floortime. So Affect Autism is a website. It's from a parent in Canada, I believe. She's got a fantastic podcast, and she brings in a lot of people in the DIR field and interviews them about different pieces. So she's a great place to start. The ICDL website also has great information, and they have training for it. Their training is all online. It was, thanks to them, I already was fairly versed in Zoom when all this shut down, because they've always done Zoom, and they are located in Baltimore, but people from all over the world, which is really cool because people from your classes will be from Turkey and China, and you can hear how the developmental world in different areas. They have classes going on constantly. The Greenspan Floortime Center is located in Bethesda and in Alexandria. They recently opened an Alexandria center. Dr. Stanley Greenspan passed away a while ago, but his son took over his practice. And so while his son is no longer connected with ICDL, the Floortime Center, if you're in Northern Virginia, it's local. I've sent my clients there, and if my clients go there, then I'll ask if I can go in and observe, because Jake Greenspan, every time I hear him talk, I'm just like, I learned something new. So I recommend going to, they have websites, they have some training. I started with some of their online work before I switched over to ICDL. Beyond Behavior, I mentioned. Uniquely Human is beautiful, by Barry Present. I'm betting some of you have already read it. It doesn't talk about floor time, but it presents floor time so beautifully. And then Engaging Autism is another great book by Stanley Greenspan that I would recommend. And then, of course, any of the Ross Green books as well. And I think some of those, because they're written, they tend to be written for typically developing children. So I think it's always kind of thinking into remembering we're going to use these skills, we're going to use these tips from Ross Green, but also remembering the child's developmental profile and individual preferences. And so going into that, if words are too much, if that auditory is too much, what can we do to bring this to what the child can access so they feel safe during these conversations? So I will stop sharing. I will admit, so I have this slide up. It's not Floortime specific. It's not Floortime specific at all, but it is. It's a little brochure. So don't think you're going to learn more about Floortime by reading it. Okay. Do you have any questions?
And I don't know how much you've been able to watch the chat, but a lot of people introduce themselves, and we have people from all different life areas. We have people who are early intervention service providers. We have grandmothers on here. We have parents. We have people that live and experience disability. So quite a wide variety, and you gave us a ton of information. And we have one question, and it'll be interesting to see how you answer this. Someone wants to know, do you agree with what Alfie Kohn said about punishment and reward? And do you agree with what Kohn was saying about ABA therapy?
Um,
So maybe you can tell us why you agree, because I think you probably do agree.
so I do. And when I was a teacher, when I was a classroom teacher, I followed Alfie Kohn pretty religiously because he, with all the punishment and reward. And so I tried to read his literature to see how to make my classroom more intrinsically motivated and building that up. And I saw in just your general education classroom, I saw how beautifully it works. If you're familiar with responsive classroom pieces at all, that's the type of thing you put in there. So I do. So as far as ABA therapy, I have my training in the school system, particularly when I was working in an intellectual disabilities classroom. I got very good at ABA practices. I find them, I think they're easier to do. He talked a little bit about the power, and you can come into a room and you have that sense of, all right, we're going to do this. You as a grown-up know exactly what you're doing. I become less regulated. I'm more regulated because I've got the control. But I agree with so much of what he said, and both from self-advocates that I've been able to read things that what they talk about as far as their experience with ABA. There's a great video called the Loud Hands Project. And it's this video that self-advocates have put together of their response to working with ABA therapists. And watching that made me start to realize, wow, yeah, we really, it's not a happy experience for the person on the other side of the table. That being said, if sometimes we have to teach critical skills. Sometimes we have to teach. There are some skills that I talked a little bit about. You can teach a child letters. That doesn't mean they understand that it's a letter. They just understand when they're shown a picture of an A, they're supposed to say A. But there are times we have to teach those skills, those critical skills. And it could be, a lot of times it's about safety and keeping the child safe. Other DIR Floortime people would probably disagree with me on some of this. I also work with clients they use ABA. It's, insurance covers ABA. If they want their child to go to an inclusive preschool setting, they have to have an ABA shadow. And so we really work on making that work and seeing what part, how to balance it. ABA is not my favorite at all. But I do agree with him, but I also see it's sometimes it is what it is. It's everything you said about the history of it. That's what I have read about it as well. The reasons, when you read Lovos's work on what he said when he started it, it's frightening. What I do see is that children when I come in to work with a child who's had intensive ABA, it's very clear that they've had ABA. And they are very prompt dependent. They'll sit. And I've had one child who said if he wanted something, he would tap the table, because he knew, he's like, look, I've got calm hands, or I've got quiet hands, instead of asking for it. And so it's almost this training that I don't want you to be prompt dependent. I want you to be this person. And so I think ABA, before they're really at that stage, if they've got they're going through those developmental capacities 1 through 3, maybe even 1 through 6, yeah, you can start to bring in ABA, and there's some great things you can do. And I think ABA as a whole they're doing a lot more to respond to they're doing naturalistic teaching. They're changing. They're not, so you look at Lovos, and I do see more of honoring the child pieces there. But when it is brought in too soon, it actually it shuts down that ideation and the child's development of agency. And so it developmentally just shuts that part of the brain down. Not that it can't come back on, but it takes a little while. Okay, I'm looking at the chat. Oh, Lily, it looks like you said, and thank you for congratulating my husband being in remission. When should DIR be started? I mean, ideally, it started right away. you know, in the beginning, and that's when you're going to have the most success. So the little child that I talked about that started me looking at this journey, his family didn't do ABA at all. They started, the minute they got their diagnosis, they turned and went to DIR. And that's when you're going to see it the most successful. But it doesn't mean it can't be started at any point. And yeah, like I said, Gail Tippy has a program out in California that has children living on, or excuse me, I'm so sorry to say children, has adults living on a farm while they're doing DIR. So it's not being on the floor, but it's the people they're working on the farm with are helping them through all of these capacities. So it's not necessarily an age thing. Let's see. I'm looking at the questions again. Like Susan says, she recently learned a bit about cell danger response as a result to my functional medicine research. I'm curious about the concept that might oh, interesting. If autism is biologically based versus psychological and emotionally based. So I don't know much about that. I would love if you would email me any of your research you have. My children actually have PANDAS, so pediatric autoimmune neuro psychological disorder associated with strep. So this is exactly, that's really brought my attention to how biology, all these pieces go together and what is going on with the cells.
Sometimes it can be more difficult to write certain kinds of questions or comments in the chat box. So if you do have something you'd like to say, you can raise your hand virtually and we can unmute you so that you can share your comment or question, because sometimes they're a little more complex. Oh, okay. I see a Chris Mitchell. You should be able to speak.
Hello.
Hi, Chris.
So what's like to get along with children?
Can you say that again?
What's like to get along with the children?
What it's like to be alone with my children?
Get along with them.
Get along with them.
Get along with them. It's great. And that's what I love about Floortime, is that when I was doing behavioral practices, it was much more getting the child to sit and work. And now it's you're going for the laugh. You're getting the exact glint in the eye, that little like mischievous eye glint when the child really lights up and is ready to interact with you. That's what you're going for in Floortime. And in my training in behavioral practices, not everybody's, but we were told the minute they got that look to shut it down. Like, don't let them, go back to having them be compliant. So getting along with children and being able to play with them is amazing.
That's awesome. Okay, I see Mahaya. You should get a prompt on your screen that will tell you to unmute. Okay, if it's not working, I can come back to you. And okay, I'm going to come back to you, Mahaya. Lily.
Hey, how are you? First of all, I just wanted to let you know that was really what I was hoping for in tonight's lesson, because when I was listening to him last night, he was not giving a lot of examples of how this was being used versus what, I guess, the old style. My two questions are this: if someone is living in a 2-parent home where they live in like the mom's house and then they go sometimes to the dad's house, how do you deal with that situation? And then if you find out that or not if you find out, but how do you deal with going from ABH therapy, transitioning into the floor time, or transitioning into a new way, this new way of thinking, which is floor time, which is these other therapies that work? Do you understand my questions?
I think so. So the first question is how, when a child lives in two different houses
Yes.
and is going back and forth. And so it's so tricky. And there's got to be so many pieces to that puzzle, but a key piece is helping both families and both houses, making sure they're on the same page with how they're going to react to behaviors that, a lot of times when I coach in schools and I'm helping schools transition to having inclusive programs, well, we sit down and work with co-teachers or with the paraprofessional and the teachers to actually go through the nitty-gritty, defining the problem behaviors, and then what are they going to do? How are they going to react to it? Almost making this flow chart. If this doesn't work, do this. And I imagine that might be the same if a child is in two different households, is being able to have the families really talk it out. What are we going to do? And then also always assuming positive intentions of the other adult, which is I think it's extremely hard even in schools, and it's going to be harder when it's someone you're co-parenting with, but to be able to keep that open communication for the child. The other part was that transition from ABA to DIR. That's not something, what I've heard from people who work in DIR schools, like the Rebecca School in New York, is that really what they have to do is just kind of let the child be in the school for a little while and not be intrusive, because what they find is they're so used to adults just sitting, adult comes by, you sit, adult comes by, you comply. And so letting them develop their sense of self, and it can often be hard, because if you have developed your sense of self in complying with what an adult tells you, it is going to take a little while to not be trying to do what an adult tells you to. So I saw someone in the chat put, they wanted the link for the farm, the Dirty Hands Developmental Alliance. I put that in there. And then Allison talked about presuming competence, which is another one of my favorite topics. So you can, I'll try not to talk about that too much. Presuming competence is that idea that we believe the child or the individual can, I'm sorry, I'm trying to shift brains. I have a whole other presentation on presuming competence. To help myself process this, I work with a child named Joey. I blog about him for Joey's Foundation. He has cerebral palsy and uses an AAC eye gaze device to communicate. So when I present on the research I'm doing around Joey, I talk a lot about presuming competence, because Joey is, at first it was believed that he had the cerebral palsy caused extensive brain damage. He had a seizure, a stroke, and his brain was flooded, but it turns out it was only the motor area of the brain. And so when constantly in my work with him, I always have to assume that he knows what he is, I have to presume competence, that he is doing, he knows it, because if I don't, I could continue, if we only reacted to what he shows us, we would continue to think he's operating on like a 2 or 1 year old level. And so that idea of presuming competence is that it's a least dangerous assumption. We're going to make wrong decisions when we're making decisions about a child's education or what we're going to do with a child. What's the worst thing that we could do? What is to presume a child can't do something that they actually can. And so for him, if I rely on my data constantly, I'm like, oh, well, this is what it is. But if I'm watching for all these cues, which Floortime has really helped me to do, you guys, I realized the other day, last week, I was like, he can't read because his word, he can't say the words out loud. But I tried something of like having him read a text and then showing him a picture, and he got it right every time. And I was like, okay, I wasn't presuming competence. Yeah, and that the term I had used was, I had mentioned presuming positive intention, and then as I went on into my presuming competence spiel, I was like, oh, maybe you meant that. But anyway, presuming competence is a piece in all of this. All right, any other questions?
Lucy, didn't you have something you were going to ask?
Yeah, and I seem to be muted. Can you hear me?
No, I hear you. You're not muted. We hear you.
Well, sorry about that. Anne, I feel like I must have been living under a rock for many, many years, because it was only in the last 2 months when we started talking about presentations for this that we learned about Floortime through Alfie. And so my question is any of this being taught at the college level now? It just seems like every parent, every person we work with and know, they are told, especially if they're labeled with autism, that they need to have ABA, and they probably need 40 hours a week of ABA. So it seems like it's really hard for people to know of any other options. And that's why I'm curious, how and where is it being taught, or is it?
I don't know. I mean, I'm constantly working with special educators that I mention I do this, and they're like, I've never heard of that before, which I'd been in the field for 15 years before I'd heard of it. Actually, Joey's grandmother's a special ed teacher, and I think she'd a special ed professor at a college in Pennsylvania, and she'd kind of heard of it, but everything she knew is behavioral. And then as we got into it, she's like, oh yeah, that's everything I believe. It's not big out there. There is research out there. My understanding, and now I'm trying to be balanced here, is that I'm on Floortime mailing list, so I get these kind of notifications. I'm sure there's information on the other side as well, if we're going to call it sides, but ABA has a very big lobby, and the insurance piece is the biggest piece here. And in some states, insurance will cover DIR, but in a lot they won't. And then when I know California just went through a fight as they were trying to open insurance to other alternatives, and the ABA lobbyists were really big into pushing that. There's a lot of pieces here, and it's just not known. And that's one of the frustrating things when I started taking these classes, and then I started doing it and seeing it work, was like, why are we not talking about this in schools? But it's not there. And I think a big piece of it is ABA works because it does. I'm going to teach your child to sit down in a chair and put their hands in their lap. And then first, that's amazing. Like, your child hasn't been sitting, and all of a sudden they are, and they have their hands in their lap. And so when people see that, that's kind of what they're like, oh yeah, let's keep doing that. And so, I saw that work, when you're working with children in early intervention, I saw that work for somebody else. This ABA is great. It's going to change everything. And there's just not a lot. And there's an exposure piece, and then there's also this idea that, like, yeah, you're sitting on the floor. I think part of the problem is it's called Floortime. A lot of people think they're doing it, but they haven't had the training. They don't understand that the neurodevelopmental piece. So I don't.
Sounds like they need some branding.
Yes.
They need someone for branding it. You mentioned, I think you're right, the insurance is a huge piece. Do you said there are some states that do allow for billing insurance for DIR. I would be interested in what states do.
I'll have to see,
Okay.
I'll have to get back to you on that, because I think, truthfully, I think they do. It might be, I can't remember if it passed in California or not.
Okay, okay. Well, and I can do some research too, but it is certainly interesting to know that in Virginia, it is allowed in Virginia for ABA, and so it is interesting to look at it from the perspective of parents having the choice, the option for what works best for their child and that sort of thing. So thank you for mentioning that.
Now, if you are a parent who's looking for this, so you can find a speech pathologist or an occupational therapist who does it. And so, and that can be covered by insurance. There are some counselors that will do it, and then they can bill you they can do insurance as though they're doing it for counseling, but they won't do it specifically for DIR. But for like just pure DIR floor time, you're not backdooring in through another service. But if you are looking, that's a great place to start. And then you just have to be sure that the person that you're going to has an actual floor time background, like from ICDL, and they've been certified. And they at least, it's best if they have at least a basic certification, because then they've gone through more classes. A lot of people say they do floor time, but by that they mean, oh, I sit on the floor with the child and I play.
Right, right. Okay. I think there's probably time for just one more question. I see in the chat box, would this type of therapy work for a young adult around age 25, PTSD and aggression?
So I don't know. I don't see, so much of it is just, I feel like it's respecting the individual so much that I would think it does. I'm probably not the person to ask. One, in this infant mental health fellowship that I'm in, I heard about circle of security, and that to me is very, very similar in how they're coaching and responding, and that is actually used with young adults with PTSD and aggression. Not necessarily that they have an atypical neurological profile, but that they've experienced significant trauma. And so that it's worth looking into. There's other pieces out there. I don't see why DIR floor time wouldn't work. It goes back to that idea that the Dirty Hands Project, and where's that aggression coming from? It's going to take longer as they're older and they have more to get, more processes. You've got a lot more shark music going on there, but I don't see why it couldn't.
Okay, very helpful. I also just looked up really quickly. You said circles of safety, right? I looked it up and put it in the chat box as someone, if anyone wanted to look it up.
Thank you. It's circles of security. So let me make sure
wait, yeah. Don't anybody follow that because I don't know what it is yet.
That's
yeah.
silence.
Let me.
Okay, I just typed circles of. Oh, good. And you know what? You can't delete. I tried to delete it. It looks like you can't do that. Okay, so that's not it. Circles of security. Thank you.
I'll put it in there.
Thank you. All right, Lucy, anything else? I'll hand it back to you.
I think we're good. Thank you for providing such good education and giving us ideas. This was really, really helpful, Anne, and I think there will be many of us looking into it more and seeing how we can broaden people's horizons, because ABA 40 hours a week doesn't always work for everybody, and choice. People should have choices. So thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to all our panelists.
Thank you so much for having me. I was thrilled when you all asked, because it's a branding piece of just like, let's get out there. Let's talk about it.
I'm so glad.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you. Everybody have a great night, and we hope to see you all tomorrow. And as Anne mentioned, if you haven't watched The Reason I Jump, check it out. It's still on the convention website. See you all tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very, very great session, Miss Anne.
Thank you.
Very great session.
Thank you so much, Lily.
That really, like, after listening to him, I'm like, well, what sort of situation can that help in? Because like I've been in the special ed classrooms having to be like rushed into another room because of those types of situations, and I'm like, well, what do you do in those situations? But it seems like it's more about letting them just kind of, instead of the reward and punishment, it's more along the lines of just finding out why the behavior is going on, and then kind of not curbing, but trying to then what's a technique to solve the behavior.
Mm-hmm. It's really trying to understand someone. That's really great.
Well, thank you very much, Miss Ann. Do you have an email address or anything?
I do. I'll put it into the chat.
Perfect. Thank you.
And if you'll just send me your slides, we'll get those posted to the website at the end of the week, Ann.
Okay, perfect.
I keep saying that like that's far away. The end of the week is tomorrow.
Oh, goodness.
It happens fast. All right. Well, thank you. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.